Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of your Introduction to Ethics course. This week we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. And we're still on the hunt for some kind of way of evaluating our actions that is quote unquote correct, right? We want to know if what we're doing is ethical or not, if it's good or not. And utilitarianism has its own ideas about how we could evaluate that. Utilitarianism, like your book describes, is a kind of consequentialism. And like your book also says, egoism is also a kind of consequentialism. Consequentialists, regardless of if they're egoists or utilitarians, or as we're going to see in your book, hedonists or Epicureans potentially even, consequentialists, what they all have in common is that they're focused on the outcomes of your actions or of anybody's actions, right? They want to focus on the outcomes of the actions in order to evaluate whether the action was good or bad. And this is in juxtaposition to people who would like to evaluate intention. Now, where consequentialists disagree is what the best outcome is, right? A hedonist would say that the best outcome is the most pleasurable one. Whatever is going to bring you the most pleasure is the best outcome. Ayn Rand would say that whatever is going to rationally, maximally benefit you, that's the best outcome, right? Utilitarians have a bit of a different idea. In fact, they have a formula that we can use to figure out the best possible outcome for any action. But before we get into that formula, I want to go over the utilitarians' main principle, and this is called the principle of utility. This is their primary moral value. This is what they think should direct and guide all ethical actions. And the principle of utility is basically this. Our actions should seek to increase the total amount of happiness for all people over the greatest period of time, right? If we could follow that principle, if we could choose the action that is going to bring the most happiness for most amount of people in general, then that's going to be a good action. And because of this, utilitarians don't really think that there is anything that's like really intrinsically good. There are no actions, there are no beliefs, there are no ways of doing something or ways of behavior that are intrinsically good. Things or actions or people are only good if they increase the overall happiness for everyone. And we can see this is really different from like egoism or hedonism, right? Hedonism is really focused on getting pleasure. Egoism is really focused on maximizing, your own self-benefit. The hedonists and the egoists are only considering themselves when they make the actions, right? They're only considering the benefit to themselves. Utilitarians, according to some of the people that we're going to be talking about in a second here, need to be considering everyone. So utilitarianism was really founded by these two men, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And actually, Jeremy Bentham was John Stuart Mill's father's friend. Jeremy Bentham really developed utilitarianism initially, and then John Stuart Mill took Jeremy Bentham's ideas and kind of refined them into his own thing. This week for your reading, we'll be reading John Stuart Mill, although feel free to go read Jeremy Bentham if you like. So these two developed this theory of utilitarianism in the late 1700s or from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. And they're really interesting figures because they really believed in increasing the overall happiness of the greatest amount of people. They were early proponents for things like women's rights. They were anti-slavery, et cetera, and all because they're focusing on this principle of utility. So while these two have some disagreements, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, they agree about pretty much everything. We'll get to their disagreements in a second, but first, why don't we focus on their agreement? One of their major agreements is that we can calculate better or worse actions based on a formula they have provided. And this formula has 5 variables, essentially. The first variable is pleasure minus pain. When considering an action, we need to consider how much pleasure it's going to produce, and then also how much pain it's going to produce. If it's going to produce more pain than pleasure, then it's not a good act. The next thing that we need to consider is the intensity. How intense is that pleasure going to be, right? If the pleasure is going to be super duper intense, then that is more desirable than just kind of like a nice, placid sort of pleasure. The next thing to consider is duration. How long is the pleasure or happiness going to last? If it's something that's only going to make you happy for a moment, well, that's not as satisfying or as important as pleasure that's going to last for a long time. The next one is fruitfulness. Fruitfulness is kind of a strange one. And I'm not sure how you would actually change it into like a variable in an equation, although they include it. And fruitfulness is basically if an action will lead to the ability to have or produce more pleasurable actions in the future, right? So if you have an action that is going to, in the future, make more pleasurable actions happen, well, then that's more beneficial than an action that's maybe super pleasurable, but just like a one-time thing. It doesn't enable any more pleasure outside of that. Or you could have an action that makes it possible for you or other people to have more pleasure in the long run. That's a factor that we got to consider. So that's called fruitfulness, right? How much it's going to produce. And then lastly, the thing that they consider is the likelihood. What are the chances that it's going to happen, right? I mean, if we're weighing two options and one is definitely going to happen and one is not going to happen at all, then, you know, we're going to go with the one that is definitely going to happen. So anyway, these are the 5 basic things that we need to consider according to utilitarians before we do any action. And we're going to do whichever action is going to lead to the most amount of happiness according to this little formula here. Now, where Mill and Bentham disagree is about what pleasure is, kind of. Fundamentally, Bentham believed that all happiness, all pleasure was the same. If you got more pleasure out of eating a hot dog than out of reading like a poem or, you know, a piece of philosophy, well, then you should eat the hot dog. You know, or if in the end eating the hot dog brought more happiness and pleasure to everybody, then that's what you should do. Mill disagreed. Mill thought that there were 2 different kinds of pleasures. There were sensual pleasures, physical pleasures that we could feel, touch, you know, and then there were intellectual pleasures. Now, intellectual pleasures are really kind of confined to humanity, right? This is our ability to have those internal intellectual things, right? The ability to appreciate a piece of music or to read and understand a work of philosophy. You know, it's those times when we are watching like a great movie or seeing a good piece of art or reading a great book. These are the intellectual pleasures that Mill says are uniquely human and qualitatively different than sensual pleasures. Now, Mill kind of has this famous statement where he says, it is better to live as a man dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And what he's saying there is, if you think that it would be better to live as a human being than to live as an animal, like a pig, even if you were to live the worst human life, right? Like a really dissatisfied, not worse, but dissatisfied human life, versus a really satisfied pig life, right? If you could have that choice, would you want to be a really super satisfied pig, or would you want to be a dissatisfied human? If you think that you would rather be a dissatisfied human, it's because you believe that there is a qualitatively different kind of happiness or pleasure that we can experience that makes it worth it to not have even all of our essential pleasures taken care of. That means that there's a certain kind of pleasure that we as humans can experience that animals really can't, right? And the only kind of pleasure that animals can really experience are those sensual, those physical ones, not those inside, internal, intellectual ones. So if you would rather be a human dissatisfied than an animal satisfied, maybe it's because you believe that humans, even if they are unhappy, can experience something that's qualitatively better, right, than just sensual pleasures. All right, guys, that's it for the lecture this week. I'm looking forward to your comments on utilitarianism. It's a pretty interesting system. It seems really nice and smooth, right? Maybe there's some problems with it, though. Anyway, consider some of the things we've asked here. Is happiness and pleasure the best way to evaluate moral values overall? Is happiness and pleasure the thing that we should all be striving for everybody? And does that formula work? Can we use that to evaluate happiness and pleasure? Anyway, I look forward to reading y'all's comments.